between, this colorful, people tend to think of, the tropics, Africa as people of color, and all of that, confronting this, classical but colorless, architecture, this interaction between, new identities and so forth, become manifest. These are different views of it. Let me try and get to the end so we can take questions. The other project by Yinka Shonibare is at the Friedrichswerderschen Kirche museum, which is a church. It used to be a church in the 19th century, but it's one of the only remaining buildings by Friedrich Schinkel, who was this, German, the Germans think of him as the uber national architect of the 19th century. So it holds a dear place in German, historical memory, because one of the, claims, of course, was that, the use of brick, was something the Prussians claim as their contribution to, to architecture, the neoclassical revival architecture of the 19th century. So this building, is like a gem, for Germans, for Prussians and so forth. And inside, this is what it looks like on the inside. So it has all these, neoclassical sculptures, the Schinkel group, they are called. Von Shadow and so forth, images that spoke to German sense of morality, in the 19th century. This is probably the most famous of all German sculptures. These two women, the twin princes, as they are called. So this is the space where Yinka Shonibare installed his work. These are examples of the work in the museum. And so you have inside this museum Yinka Shonibare's Colonel Tarleton and his wife shooting pheasants, right? So here he is in Yinka Shonibare's classic, use of African textiles to make these headless sculptures. Here of Mr. Tarleton and his wife, Mrs. Oswald. Now, these two people in history, and these names refer to living people, people that lived at some point during the age of slavery. Their families were involved in the slave trade. And so here in this church, they are shooting a pheasant amid these classical sculptures. So this contrast again between the classical sculptures and these, they are dressed in this Victorian dress, but African fabric. These are views, and that's the pheasant that the guy has blown up, and the blood. And so it's this really melodramatic, installation. But also what's interesting here is that this used to be a church, and here you see this man and this woman killing this pheasant and the blood spattering, almost as if it invokes the bloodletting of the Christian story, of the killing of Christ and lancing of the chest, blood and all of that. So it brings into this ordered environment, this almost sense of, the rejection of that classical grandeur, as if it's rupturing the narrative. And this is something, again, that you see in the António Ole's work. Another piece of his work which directly addresses the theme of the project is this installation here of the Berlin Conference, and it's actually called the Berlin Conference, as if these are the individuals who gathered in 1884-85 to share up the continent. So it's a bit didactic. Although he created the work before our project, so we basically thought, hey, this fits into the whole thing. quite well. But in a sense, it also reminds us of the Last Supper. Because if this is a church and you see these figures like this, you immediately think of the Last Supper. But here the supper is African, the African continent, that's what they're eating, not bread and wine, right? So colonization has some kind of, eating up the continent. And finally, Pascale Marthine Tayou. I did mention, the difference between the history of the Hamburger Bahnhof and the Neuen Nationalgalerie, which is regarded, this is a view of it without, which is regarded as one of the best known examples of modernist, high modernist architecture. Mies van der Rohe, you couldn't get, more modernist than that. But this was also a building that was constructed at the height of the Cold War in the late 1960s, close to the border between East and West Germany, to show the transparency of the West, the modernity, of the West versus the closed mind of the East, because their buildings were all built of concrete and little glass. But here you have this transparent structure that emblematized all the rhetoric about, Western modernity and so forth. So this is where Pascale Marthine Tayou does his work. These are examples of his previous work that he has done with African flags, which is a critique. His work, forcefully critiques ideas of the nation in Africa, in the ways that African nations mouth their, nationness, but actually don't live up to that ideal of, nationalism and the nation. So here he installs 54 flags, ostensibly representing the 54 African nations. So if you imagine the view, the first view, it kind of reminds you of the UN, where you see all the flags, or the EU, all the flags of EU and so forth. So what does it mean to have a EU, UN sort of thing, but it's in Berlin? Is this are they claiming this building as, as a new OAU, Organization of African Unity type of thing? Or is this emblematic of the kinds of claims that the new immigrants in Europe are making on the state, on the city where they now find themselves? We too are Germans. We too are, Norwegians. We too are, and all of those things, which in turn cause some of the pushbacks that you see in the rightist movements across Europe, to push back against these, claims to, the nation and the city and all of that. But what is interesting here is that the flags are actually not quite, the flags that they seem to represent, because he sort of played around with the symbols and the motifs. So none of these flags actually look like what the flags of the African countries are supposed to be. And the anecdote here, at the opening, the Liberian ambassador who attended the opening was so mad when she saw the flag of Liberia, and she knew that someone had, really messed up, right? The design of their flag. And so she raised hell, that how can this happen? Did someone supervise that, until she was told actually none of these other countries have theirs right, So that kind of pacified her that we didn't pick out Liberia, to question their flag or something. So here you begin to see that it's not just about Europe or claiming Europe and all of that. It's also that, even these countries actually don't seem to have figured themselves out properly, in terms of their nations. Nigeria, so if the flag is not quite there, is it possible that this reflects even their own attitudes to their own nations? So it's not just about, immigrants in Europe, it's also about the Africans themselves. The last part of the project is that there are these sculptures that are installed around them. You see these structures, these sculptures. They are enlarged models from these, and these are called columns. And briefly, there were sculptures made by Africans, across the continent during the colonial period, often for ritual purposes, that were meant to tap the power of the European, So they used all these sculptures for rituals, and the sculptures represented Europeans. Well, in the days since colonization, they've become tourists, items. So if you went to any African city, you're likely to find these colons. But although they don't always look like Europeans, these days, some are actually dark-skinned and so forth. So you find, like black, figures and all of that, which in themselves begin to raise questions about the African elite who imagine themselves as Europeans, because now they are in power, the same power that the Europeans held, so that they become black Europeans in some sense. So this is a work that, in a very complicated way, question not just nation and colonialism, but also the post-colonial realities of the African countries themselves. It's not just about, what Europe has done to us or not, but also in the ways that power differentials within the African continent can and have contributed in the problems of imagining the nation. Let me stop here, and so we can take questions, and hopefully I'll get around to the reception part, of the show in Germany. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, you mentioned the lack of monuments in Berlin.
Yes.
And I was just wondering how you see this show of only African artists in correlation, or if you see any correlation to I guess also the historical amnesia in relation to the way that Africans were represented in world fairs in these same countries.
Yeah.
If there's a problem in that regard.
Well, the world fairs were colonial enterprises. They've become sort of soppy these days, like they say world fair, and they are a joke. The recent iterations of world fairs, or what people still call world fairs, are really like very little affairs compared to the colonial world fairs. They were invented during the colonial period. So world fairs were places where people demonstrated not just their powers within their nations, but the influence they had around the world. That's what made the world fairs what they were, right? So it comes as no surprise that the ways that actually quite a bit of Africa was invented by the world fairs, they were part of the process of inventing Africa. That place that needed to be colonized, that needed to be exploited, and all of those things, they were done through the world fairs. And so in the ways that the Africans were represented in the fairs were not different from the ways that they were represented by scholars, by ethnologists, and so forth. So the idea of the world fair itself is already problematic when you think of the others, the people that were represented in them. The Africans, the Asians, the South Sea, people, and all of that, people who were colonized during those periods. They didn't have a hand in the way that they were represented. And they were represented in a way that would help all the other aspects of the empire. If you imagine, for instance, the Paris World Fairs, or the ones in Britain in the 1925 Imperial, World Fair, which, some say is the greatest of the world fairs. It was simply that these people were presented in a way, they had, they would go and bring Africans, build huts for them so people would look at them and stuff. And then you could see, this is how they were when we found them, this is what we're making out of them. So you go to the industry sections of the fairs, and you will now see farmlands and all of that show that we are truly, exploiting, because it wasn't a controversial thing at the time to exploit, this is what were supposed to do, So there's that problem of how they were represented through the world fairs as part of a larger enterprise.
Is there a leakage in context to a show with only African artists?
Well, if you think of the point that I made about having artists whose ancestors were not invited to the Berlin conference, where they determined the fate of that continent. They weren't invited. So to have an exhibition where the, maybe great-grandchildren of the people who are supposed to have been there can now come to the same city where the fate of the continent was decided to make pronouncements, now as works of art. It was important to the project. We had, an idea of having, European artists that deal with colonization and all also, because there are some of, Carsten Holler and all of that deal with work in Africa, work with, do projects there. But that would have led to a different kind of project that would have, moved us quite far from what we thought was crucial, because we didn't want to let go the opportunity of the fact that it was the president of Germany that wanted a project, so that political moment we didn't want to lose. It's not like a museum, the normal thing where a museum, invite you to curate a show. This was the president of the country. It wasn't, like the Ministry of Culture, so we're having meetings with him, not with his, with his people. So that was very important to the project. And in fact, the other drama that happened was he resigned 3 days to the opening of the show. The last, what I may be wrong, but one of the last official events that he had was the reception for the show in his palace on a Sunday, May 31st. He resigned on Monday. And this is crucial. At this reception, Pascale Marthine Tayou, the artist, the Cameroonian, artist who did this work, towards the end, as we were all leaving, said to him, "So we'll see you on Thursday," because the opening was on Thursday. And the guy looks at him and says, "Who knows tomorrow?" Which is the theme of the exhibition, right? So we all laughed, he really gets it, right? He gets this in the theme of the show. Well, when he resigned the following day, we kind of got the joke was on us, because we actually didn't know because clearly he must have made up his mind that he was resigning, even as he was doing the stuff. So that was the other part. So it was clearly, then the other thing, what the ambassadors and the heads of states that were coming for the opening, there was now the dilemma of what are they going to do? Because the invitations were from the presidency, and now the president has resigned. So only 2 ambassadors showed up, because it became now really a very difficult, thing, because it was clear he couldn't come. He told us, because this will now be the topic of, people will be talking about his resignation rather than the show. So he kept away. And that meant the heads of states, the ambassadors also all had to, except the Liberian ambassador and the Angolan ambassador. The rest, kept out of the show. So there was this really political aspect to the thing. That it wasn't just about the art world, kind of thing. Yeah. Right.
I just want to take you back a little bit to this subject you've been talking about, the world fair.
Yes.
I read one somewhere in a book where there was a description on how the idea of the Congolese architecture came about. It was born through one of these world fairs in Belgium. And the Belgian architect kind of came up with this pavilion, the Congolese pavilion.
Yeah.
And then that kind of facade was adopted as Congolese identity architecturally.
Yeah.
And that idea of an imposed identity kind of rhymes for me very well with this exhibition that you bring back to Germany, which was the seat of the Scramble for Africa, and imposed the will of the diaspora, so to speak, the African diaspora, or even the Africa itself, onto Europe.
Yeah.
So I like the idea of imposing it.
Yeah, one of the things, and thanks for that comment. One of the things that came out as when the show opened, the first 3 major reviews were bloody. It was the having worked in this field for a long time. I was like, what do you expect? But my co-curators were so scandalized because they never had anything close to that in terms of the vehemence, of the criticism of the show from the major newspapers in Berlin. And they had all kinds of reasons, why they thought this was the most terrible exhibition anyone could imagine. It was historically, really out of order and all of that. Because, my co-curators deal with, German, European, contemporary art. And in those realms, you don't have really vehement criticism. It's all about, the kind of chocolate type of critiques, as I want to call them. But here you are dealing with serious political, things about the nation, and all of that. And because some read this as, we were indicting Germany for its role in history, and of course the Germans are very sensitive to, to that, which was part of, really to begin to talk about this rather than to not talk about it and think that it's been dealt with. And yet you see the rise of these far right, parties all over the place, and you don't know where they're coming from. What is it that they are reacting against, and all of that. But you found that some of the criticisms were couched in really very interesting ways, that there were too few Africans, brought in to occupy these huge museums. That was, one of them was that the works were too spectacular, that they were too popular was a refrain across the line, that they were too popular. Apparently because, work like Pascale Marthine Tayou, people came to pose with the sculptures and all of that. And for some of the critics, this was like pedestrian. It didn't, because it seems as if the ordinary people loved it. And of course, what ordinary people love is what? Kitsch, right? Instead of high art that is meant for aesthetes and so forth. So there were all kinds of ways that the criticisms were couched. The one about the few, the relative few number of artists. Of course, where does that come from? From this idea of representing Africa as a whole. It has to be comprehensive because that's the only way to deal with that continent, rather than deal with them as individuals. It's like a picture, I get it, this is Africa. What, some of us call the football team idea of, African exhibitions. And as I said, I've been involved in such shows in the past. But they were meant for a reason that we've reached a point where you have to move on, right, to a different order where you can begin to look at individual artists more closely in terms of what their work is about, and so forth. So it's this resistance to this idea that you can now have one artist have this huge installation that is meant for only people like Christo, or something. But these non-entities, these, not well-known African artists given that status, that was too much for so many people, especially the critics. Yeah. Any more?
Yeah, I guess I'm wondering how did the participation in this exhibition sort of affect the artists? Or?
Well, it's good news for any artist to be seen by this many people. The reviews for this show, actually there's a booklet, almost 100 pages because almost every newspaper in Germany had something to say about the show. TV stations, and all of that. Radio stations even all pitched in, to their own opinion or brought in people to talk about this show, what they thought about it, and so forth. As an artist, it can't get any better, right? So even if the work is, like they say, no criticism is bad criticism, for artists. So I think for the artists, it's all for good, because then they can be taken more seriously by curators who are looking for artists and so forth, serious artists who have had major shows and all of that. So it puts them, but of course, these are also artists who are accomplished already. So it's not like they were artists we just were trying out. When I presented this project in Lagos, one of the questions that was, criticisms actually, was that we selected already well-known artists instead of, and my response was, there are certain projects you don't do experiments with, experiments in the sense of, there's this, guy that has just come out of art school and he's terrific, and let's have him on this pedestal, on this stage. It may work, it may not work, and at a certain level, you don't. This is beyond the level where you experiment. You try to discover artists, especially when you know what is at stake. If the criticism of the show was that, why the heck, what kind of artists are these? They can't even figure out their work. That would be a terrible thing to have if that had been the criticism instead of the issues that we really wanted to engage with. And I felt good, when someone said, the critics said, "Oh, they are too spectacular," rather than they really suck as works of art. So, all right. Thank you so much for your audience. Hi.